Hi everybody, it's 314 React here. Today we're going to be looking at Crysis Remastered. Now with the DLSS update that you should be able to get for free from the Epic Store if you just update the game, you should now see the option of DLSS under the video settings. So I'm running the same settings I was running before: 4K, SMA 1, display frequency 98, VSync on, advanced, everything's set. Can it run Crysis? HDR's off because my editing software has problems with that. DLSS we're going to turn up to quality, the maximum setting. Found this setting a bit confusing, because all the other settings, the highest possible setting is at the bottom. Can it run Crysis? So before, when I was doing some previous testing on this, I was turning it up to here going, oh, that's ultra performance, you know, maximum ultra. It's at the bottom of the list, says ultra, not realizing that it's the lowest setting, which should be here, just below off. So it's worth noting, if you turn on DLSS in Crysis, the top setting is one from the bottom, not the bottom one, like all the other settings. With that on, and those settings, let's dive into the map village. Bearing in mind, I'm going to be reading out the FPS on this. I've got the NVIDIA Performance Overlay up, but NVIDIA Shadowplay doesn't record that, so I'm just going to be reading out the FPS every now and then. This isn't supposed to be a super accurate benchmark. This is just a general look at how the DLSS looks at various settings and its effect on the FPS. This game is still relatively single-threaded based on the original 2007 engine. I think the more objects there are on screen, the more the CPU is under load because it handles the way those objects are put to screen instead of handing it over to the GPU. So it'll be interesting to see if DLSS makes any real difference in really CPU busy areas. So yeah, let's dive in.
Son of a bitch. God damn it! What's happening, boss? We're dropping like flies.
I'd tell you if I knew. You have my word. Stand back now. I'm gonna vaporize.
So long, mate.
Thus far, we're running at 52 frames a second, and it looks pretty sharp and very nice in this area. I think you can tell there's a bit of blur, but not a great deal. So let's turn DLSS off. So things look a bit more sharper in the trees there. If you're at highest resolution and full screen on YouTube, you may be able to notice it. But I'm definitely noticing the trees in the distance look a lot sharper. Sometimes you want to blur leaves a little bit so they don't look too aliased and sharp and horrible. But we are down to 38 frames a second here. So that's shaved a good 10 plus frames off with DLSS off. I think some of the textures on the gun look a little bit sharper as well. So we're running 34 frames here. And I think just giving it a quick look, I don't think you'd be able to tell the difference between DLSS on and off. So let's turn DLSS back on to quality. So we're at 34 frames there. So that's DLSS on quality. And you know what? The frame rate has gone up by 1 frame. I think this is quite a CPU intensive area, so I don't think it's going to make too much difference. But you know what? This actually looks better, at least in this area. In my opinion, this looks better than it was in native, because I'm seeing less aliasing along the top of the building, just in the distance there. The trees look more smooth and natural because they're less aliased, which is really nice. And there's certain other smoothing outs of aliasing that was on the character there and along that tree, and a lot in the foliage as well. So this area here, I'm going to flick DLSS back off. Yeah, this area here, I think looks better with DLSS on. It may look slightly less sharp, but at the moment with DLSS off, I think it looks too sharp because you're seeing tiny amounts of stair stepping. Now you can probably counteract that with either running it internally at a higher resolution, which isn't supported natively, or you can crank up the anti-aliasing quality to the absolute max, like SMA 2X. So that looks a little bit smoother, and it's at 34 frames a second. I think that's actually added in more blur, especially these little bushes here and around the gun, than DLSS did, which is really interesting. So there's just one more thing I want to try. I want to turn DLSS back off, and then I want to turn TAA on. So that's TAA on, temporal anti-aliasing, which I've always found in the CryEngine games to be a bit too blurry. Yeah, you can still see some stair stepping on the rock there. That bush looks a bit blurry. Looks pretty good. Frame rates about the same, 34, 35. Yes, there's noticeable blur when you move around, especially in the trees and stuff, which is not great. And as we turn around back here, this area, because there's less objects on screen, I think it should be less CPU intensive. So we've got 41 frames here with TAA on. This area is going to give us a much better view of what the GPU is doing. If we go to SMA 2TX, still 41 frames. Doesn't look too much different. There's just less blur in the trees. Or maybe there's the same amount, actually. I'm guessing that TX at the end is something to do with temporal anti-aliasing. So I think, yeah, it must be. So we're getting the same blur that we get when moving around as we get with TAA, with SMAA. That explains the blur. SMA 1X should get a lot less blur. Yeah, there we go. But the frame rate, oh, doesn't feel as good. It's actually a little bit lower in this area, 33 frames a second. And it looks a lot closer to no anti-aliasing, of course, but slightly better. And this area, still getting around 38, 40 frames. So let's turn that anti-aliasing completely off and then DLSS back up to quality. We are now at 61 frames. So we're getting on towards almost doubling the frame rate in this area. And we don't have any excessive blur on trees and things when moving like we do with the temporal AA. So let's just step through the DLSS quality iterations. Let's find a nice area. Still some major frame rate hits. Like here is 28 frames. Because I think I've seen a video from Digital Foundry where they say that the CPU handles most of the object instantiation. And the higher the resolution, the more objects, so the more impact on the CPU. So at 4K, there's going to be a heavy hit on the CPU as well as the GPU. So 30 FPS here, DLSS on quality. It looks really nice. Like I said, there's no blur in the trees when you're moving around. Everything looks really smooth. There's only some slight odd shimmering on the, I think if we look down here, on the textures on the gun. So I'm just going to have a look. Going to go back to the no DLSS, no anti-aliasing. I'm going to see if that shimmering's still there. It could be something to do with the denoiser from the ray tracing. Yeah, that shimmer's still there. That's no anti-aliasing. You can really see the impact of that in the trees up ahead. And still 28 frames a second. So yeah, definitely a CPU-based thing here. Let's crank on SMA 2TX. Still 28 frames, but no shimmering on those textures. So it looks like the temporal AA really sorts out the shimmering on those textures. If we leave SMA 2TX on, I wonder if it stays on even with DLSS and sorts out that shimmering. So we can kind of get the best of both worlds. Interestingly, the shimmering is still gone. And now the shimmering's back with no anti-aliasing. So when you enable DLSS, it's still implementing the anti-aliasing by the looks of it, which is really interesting because I thought that would have displaced it completely. We're now up to 30 frames here. The only trouble is I wonder if that brings over some of the blur from the temporal anti-aliasing. So I think the best setting, if you've got the power, is to crank DLSS up to quality, but also make sure that you have some form of anti-aliasing here set to reduce shimmering on textures, which is odd because you shouldn't really be getting shimmering on textures with DLSS. I guess it depends on how it's reconstructing that image using the machine learning. And I guess when you've got anti-aliasing, you've got more information in the base image for the ML to work off of. So if we turn on SMA 2TX on and then DLSS off, yeah, I'm getting that noticeable blur in the trees. I don't know if it's visible in the video, but when I move, you can see the trees are blurring. And then as soon as I stop, you can see them. It takes a little while for them to stop blurring, which has always been distracting for me, like I say, in CryEngine games. But with temporal anti-aliasing on and DLSS on as well, I don't think that blur's there, or it's just less noticeable. I think there's still a bit of blur there, definitely a lot less noticeable. I wonder if the lowest level of SMA that doesn't have temporal anti-aliasing mixed with it has the same effect. Yes, it does. No shimmering there or there. So it looks like you don't even need to enable the temporal anti-aliasing. You can just enable SMA 1, hit that, and it seems that just adding in that extra bit of information for the DLSS to work off of can prevent shimmering on this texture here. So that's what I'd recommend. So there's one final test for this, and then we'll move on, is to go into this more GPU limited area, and we can see the difference of running various modes and anti-aliasing levels and see the effect on the frame rate. So this is 63 frames, 65 frames here with DLSS at quality, and the anti-aliasing at SMA 1. So we pump up that SMA to SMA 2TX. Frame rate's basically the same. So that was running about 63 to 65 frames a second. Let's turn this to performance mode, which is the second lowest mode for DLSS. So we're up to 78 frames a second there. Much smoother. That's a good 14 frames, 14, 15 on top of what we're doing. But everything is a lot more noticeably blurry, especially in the trees there and the leaves. Barrel of the gun seems a bit more blurry. I mean, you're not really going to notice that much while playing normally. If you're running on lower hardware, performance is still pretty good. It's not that much more noticeable than quality mode, but does give you a good extra few FPS. Now, if we go to balanced, should, as it says, give us the best of both worlds. 67 FPS, 68, still looks fairly nice. You're probably not really going to notice the difference between this and quality when actually playing the game. But of course, this area here is still very CPU limited. As I said, I think Digital Foundry found that even the highest sort of CPUs are still going to struggle with this because it's so single-threaded and the way it handles objects on screen. I'll link that video in the description if I can find it. But for these areas where the GPU's more being hit, and if you lower other settings, like if you turn the object's quality down, that should help out. Of course, staying down the other settings is going to help. Now let's go to Ultra Performance. See, for me, this is where it starts to look a lot more like the original DLSS that came out a few years ago. So in this area, we're getting 96 frames a second. So we're up about 30 frames a second from where we were with quality, and probably up around 50 from where we were without any DLSS. Now this is where it becomes noticeable, very noticeable. There's certainly some issues here. See some odd stair stepping, blur, but it does give a good frame rate. So if you're running with a more mid-end RTX card and you want ray tracing on, Ultra Performance can probably get you to that frame rate that you want. If you're running a 3060 or a 2060, something like that, I think any of the 2000 series is going to struggle with this game with RTX on. I'd probably recommend balanced, but if you really want those extra few frames and want to turn down a few other settings, Ultra Performance is still a good setting because it still looks really good. So yeah, the DLSS settings are really good. There's a lot to play around with pretty much no matter what you're running. And the DLSS will certainly help out if you're struggling to run the RTX, which is really hard to run. So let's crank it back up to quality, leave SMA 1X on, and let's try and move forward with the level. I want to go to an area where it's a bit more distance, a bit more details. Okay, so this is the area I want to check out. We're running about 18 frames a second here, which is horrendously bad, and I think it's to do with this village that's out here because there's a lot of stuff down there, and again 16 frames a second there. Now my CPU is a Core i7-6700K, so it's not the newest, but I think even with the one of the most strongest CPUs ever, unless it has really good instructions per clock, you know, single core performance, it's still going to struggle in this area because it is, like I say, so single threaded. So here we are, 15 frames a second. It's a little bit better when we zoom in, but still pretty bad. So here's where we turn off the DLSS and see if that makes any difference. I don't think it will. Yep, still 17 frames a second. I think the further you go on in the game, the more CPU dependent it becomes because the more action that's happening on screen. I think DLSS is just gonna make things look marginally better, depending on your opinion. I think it looks better with DLSS on than it does with any of the anti-aliasing settings on their own. Like I said, unless you've got a very high CPU or you turn down some other settings like objects, it's not going to make too much of a difference. It's always going to tank on the CPU side of things just because of the way this engine's built. Hopefully one day they do a rebuild from the ground up or something, or port the whole thing over to a newer CryEngine. But then this is built off of the console version of Crysis, which was built on CryEngine 3. So it should be more multi-threaded, I'm not sure. Because I think this uses some weird hybrid of Vulkan and DirectX 11 or something like that for the ray tracing to work, which is so odd. So I'm just going to play a bit more of the game here. Just going to go into this village and blow some stuff up, and we'll see how the performance goes throughout. Whoa! So when you actually get in the base and there's less objects on screen and stuff going on, frame rate goes much more reasonable. So we're at about 30, 40 at the moment. It's just those distant areas where there's a lot of objects on screen. I think that's where it just hammers the CPU. So I think for sure the ambient occlusion looks a lot better. The early implementation of ambient occlusion with Crysis, in Warhead at least, was really bad. But I think the ray tracing is handling it now, so it looks much more natural. See, it's interesting that even with the ray tracing on at 4K, the CPU is still the thing that seems to be holding it back. Which just shows how not exactly optimized for multiple cores this game is. which is kind of ironic given how forward-thinking it was in so many other ways. So yeah, I definitely think it's showing its age still in some ways. They should have updated the rest of the engine, because there's more complex areas and things going on in games like Breakpoint, and that game runs at pretty much 70 frames a second for me, and rarely ever dips down. Even when you've got huge areas full of enemies, loads of objects on screen, it's still really smooth. But Crysis, nowhere near as large or as complex, but the frame rate tanks. See, this area looks quite smooth as well. Frame rate's okay. But then looking over that area, frame rate just dies again. So yeah, overall, that is Crysis with DLSS. Crysis Remastered with DLSS. Which is unfortunately only available on Epic. It's not on Steam or anything like that as far as I know, unless it is now. I haven't seen it on there, so you do have to get this off of the Epic Store, which, you know, it's not great. Overall, I'm quite happy with the performance, quite happy how it looks. DLSS seems to improve a lot of games, and it offers quite a nice performance boost in GPU-intensive areas. Thanks for watching. Hope everyone's staying safe. Please do like and subscribe, hit the little bell, really helps the channel, and I will see you in the next video.